Okay, Year 11, so the second part of your conflict and tension for paper 1, we're going to be looking at the League of Nations. So in the previous video I spoke to you about the Treaty of Versailles, and one of the aspects of the Treaty of Versailles was the setting up of this group to maintain world peace, the League of Nations. So for the League of Nations we're going to go through on a little journey looking at the setting up of it, what its aims were, the organisation of it, and then we're going to look at some of its major events, its successes, its failures, and then thinking about the 16-mark questions that could come up. For the League of Nations then, so let's think about the aims. The League of Nations wanted to stop war, that's its principal aim, wants to make sure that there's no war like the one that had just happened in World War I. They also want to achieve, improve the working lives of people around the world, so the idea that people in various countries would benefit from the League of Nations work. Disarmament, so going along with world peace, all countries would disarm and not have weapons to fight each other with. And also things like encouraging trade, trying to increase relations between countries, that would promote that peace as well. So encouraging trade and making sure the Treaty of Versailles was being enforced safely and properly as well. Those are the aims. How is it organised? The key things to remember for the League of Nations: we have the Assembly, that's all members of the League of Nations having a meeting once a year. Okay, so the League of Nations meeting once a year, all the members discussing all the big issues, and all of their decisions had to be made by unanimous vote. We also have the Council, which has a few permanent members, 4 permanent members, but 7 or 8 of the most important members of the League of Nations who would meet 3 or 4 times a year to discuss the issues, or the most pressing issues, and decide what was going to be discussed in the Assembly. We then have, underneath the Assembly and Council, we have the Court of Justice, which is there to discuss the legal issues and the ins and outs of all the big problems of the world. The Secretariat, who is like the administration, they carry out all the main actions. And we have various sub-working groups working on those working conditions, and we'll talk about them later on. We also then need to look at the membership. When the League of Nations is set up, we must remember the USA was not a member. That's a really important thing to remember. As soon as the League of Nations was set up, America was never a member, a really powerful country. The Soviet Union was not invited at first, and nor was Germany. And we'll talk about the positives, the negatives of the League of Nations setup in a little bit. Then we have to look at some of the big events that the League of Nations were involved in. And the first decade to look at is the 1920s. And we want to look at the successes and we want to look at the failures. So let's look at the successes first of all. The main successes in the 1920s for the League of Nations is on the sub-commissions, is the little agencies that work at some of the more minute issues around the world. For example, trade is supported by the encouragement of new shipping lanes and the creation of shipping lanes around the world, which makes trade easier. The Health Committee is set up, which eventually becomes the World Health Organization, to tackle some of the major diseases, and it does have a massive effect around the world. Some of the most major diseases see a drop in death rate from those diseases. Workers are supported by, there's an end to child labour in many countries around the world, and there's also a banning of lead in paint, making working environments safer around the world. And 400,000 prisoners of war are returned to their home countries as a part of those subcommittees. So some very, very fine work by the League of Nations there. We also need to look at when one of the League of Nations' main roles was when they had to step in for a big conflict. There was a potential big conflict in the Ireland Islands between Sweden and Finland. That is sorted out by the League of Nations as well. The land is given to the Swedish on the premise that the land that there's no army bases set up there, and therefore the dispute is solved. However, there is some failures as well. Some failures of the League of Nations in the 1920s happened in some of the disputes that happened. In Vilna, in Lithuania, the capital of Lithuania, Polish forces march in and take over the city, and Lithuania asks for help. But the League of Nations aren't forthcoming with that help. They know of Polish alliances with France, and they're a bit wary, and the matter is not resolved, and Poland take over the city of Vilna. We also have an issue in Corfu in the early 1920s, where basically an Italian general was killed, and as kind of revenge for that, the Italians take over the island of Corfu, which belongs to Greece, and demand compensation. Italy are basically bullying Greece for money whilst also having their land. However, despite some appeals to the League of Nations and the League of Nations stepping in and suggesting that Mussolini, the Italian leader, leaves and there's an investigation, the League of Nations buckle under pressure from Mussolini and demand that Greece give compensation. So the powerful country Italy has proven that if you're powerful and you're forceful, the League of Nations will not stop you. We also have an incident in 1925 in Bulgaria where Greece attack the Bulgarians, and they are demanded that they pay compensation and return what they have taken, and Greece have to accept. It's kind of like double standards. Italy was allowed to bully Greece, but Greece was not allowed to demand anything from Bulgaria. So we have some successes and failures in the 1920s there. Two more failures to talk about that aren't about world incidents, like conflicts, is the Locarno Treaty and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The Locarno Treaty in 1925 was the agreement between France and Germany to settle some of the disputes from the Treaty of Versailles, but also to agree to not fight each other in future, when there's been future conflict or when there's future dispute. And Britain, Italy and Belgium also signed up to the Locarno Treaty. The League of Nations did not organise this, they were not part of this in any way, but it's a failure for the League of Nations because we've got countries sitting around a table discussing peaceful matters without the League's help. What's the point in the League of Nations? We then have the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, where 65 countries agree to solve all disputes by peaceful matters, in peaceful ways. Again, no League of Nations involvement. What's the point in the League of Nations? They became known as a talking shop. It's where you discuss things, but where does things actually get done? We then look at some of the major incidents. We then get to the 1930s. We've looked at our successes and failures in the 20s, but when we get to the 1930s, we start seeing two of the most major case studies, the two main things that you could get questions on in the exam, a 12 marker or an 8 marker. And that's the incident in Manchuria and the incident in Abyssinia. In Manchuria, the incident starts kicking off in about 1931, so this Chinese land is invaded by the Japanese. Now, why did Japan want to be in China? Well, Japan is suffering after the Great Depression and wants to take the resources that belong in Manchuria. They've got a militaristic government that want to prove to its people that it's got a lot of power, and also the Japanese own a railway in Manchuria, so it's an easy place to use, or they've already got facilities there, so it's a good landing place for troops. And it all kicks off with the Mukden incident in 1931, where on the Japanese railway line in China there is an explosion, and it is pinned and blamed on the Chinese. The Japanese use that as an excuse to invade, and they remove the current leader. They rename Manchuria Manchukuo and place a Chinese man in charge, but he is a puppet leader for the Japanese. The Japanese are effectively in control of Manchuria. They've even renamed it. They've taken over and they've said it's a retaliation for the attack on the train line there. China appealed to the League of Nations, and in October 1932, the League of Nations sends one of its officials, Lord Lytton, to investigate. Sorry, they sent him in 1931, he arrives in 1932. So Lord Lytton in 1932 makes his report after almost a year, just mewing over the facts and taking his time. Shows you how much the League of Nations potentially cared about China's keeping hold of Manchuria. Lord Lytton discovers that Japan is at fault and Japan is to blame and they should be punished and the land should be returned to China. However, Japan ignores the League of Nations, they ignore the report, and they decide to leave the League of Nations, and they stay and they invade the rest of China by 1937. Do the League of Nations step in and stop after the Lord Lytton report? No. It suggests their moral condemnation, they tell them off, but they don't do anything else. So we have a big failure. The League of Nations is shown to be weak in not stepping in on a major incident. We then get to 1935, where we have the incident in Abyssinia in Africa, which is now known as Ethiopia. In Abyssinia, Italy have desires. Now, Abyssinia is independent. Italy wants to invade for their raw materials. Italy wants to increase their prestige. Mussolini, the Italian leader, wants to expand the Italian Empire, especially as Africa is made up with a lot of colonies of Britain and France. So Mussolini wants to establish his power in Africa. There's a clash of troops in 1934 at a place called Wow Wow, which the Italians show their force and use as an excuse to fight the Abyssinians. And in October 1935 we have the full invasion. A really unfair invasion in many ways. The Italians are fighting with tanks and guns and planes, whereas the Abyssinians are fighting with, in some cases, on horses and with spears. So a really unfair fight, and Haile Selassie, the leader of Abyssinia, appeals to the League of Nations, makes a really impassioned appeal for the Assembly, saying how this is wrong. The League of Nations offer very little. Moral condemnation, that word coming up again. Moral condemnation, telling Italy off, telling them that they should not have done it. Some small, minor economic sanctions are put in place, but it all comes to a head in December 1935 when French and British politician Horan Laval meet Mussolini or Italian officials and offer Italy part of Abyssinia if they let the Abyssinians keep other parts, basically offering them the best chunks of Abyssinia. This is done secretly away from the League of Nations. So not only has the League of Nations failed in trying to stop the Italians, they only gave minor economic sanctions, they didn't stop trading oil. If they had done, then how would Italy have used their tanks? But they didn't stop that. Moral condemnation, telling them off, and then they two of the main countries try and organise a secret deal, the Hohen-Laval Pact, which then gets released in newspapers, and people say, even your main members don't trust the League of Nations. It's a complete shambles. So all of these things have been building up. Why did the League of Nations fail? World War II starts, and it's the kind of signals the end of the League of Nations. And you could get a 16-mark question that says, why did the League of Nations fail? And we can see these things. We can see the different factors that we could use. We could talk about that membership, the fact that USA was never a member. The most powerful and richest country in the world could have stepped in and helped with some of the big issues and been a real voice and a real deterrent for some of the countries that were causing trouble. Germany was not invited at first, so immediately you have a country that was involved in the major conflict, the reason the League of Nations was set up, not being invited to some of those peace talks. That's why Locarno and Calais-Briand are organised without the League of Nations. The organisation of it, the assembly only meeting once a year. How can you get things done when you only meet once a year? How can you get things done with just a unanimous vote? If one country disagrees, then everything is blown out of the water. So that makes things really difficult as well. We also have the fact that the council took a lot of the power for themselves. So that organisation of having 4 permanent members, they're going to look after one another, which we kind of see that kind of fear of standing up to Italy in Corfu, that fear of standing up to Japan in Manchuria, and that fear of standing up to Italy again in 1935. We then also have to look at some of the actions the League of Nations took. It's going to fail if it doesn't deal with incidents properly. And all those incidents in the 20s, in like Vilna, in Corfu, show their weakness, but Manchuria and Abyssinia are prime examples of the League of Nations not being able to do anything effective. And finally, what about the power of the League of Nations, the lack of power? We've already mentioned the lack of the USA, but what did the League of Nations, could they actually do? It was written into the Constitution that they could offer moral condemnation, they could tell you off, or they could give you economic sanctions. They could take some kind of trade away from you. Something that's not a real deterrent to people like Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. So we see our different reasons why the League of Nations failed, and hopefully these key points will help you in your exam.